All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So tonight I'll be presenting on Black Freethought and radical politics from roughly the era of World War I to the end of the Civil Rights Movement. This talk stems from a book I'm completing entitled Black Freethinkers, African American Secularism, 1800 to 1975, which will be published by Northwestern University Press. Before I get into sort of the heart of my talk, I'd like to give some quick background on the origins of Black Freethought. African American Freethought arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Unlike the Enlightenment origins of Freethought among white intellectuals such as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, Black Freethought grew out of the institution of slavery and the conditions that blacks endured within it. So the increased evangelism to slaves that characterized the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century also brought to the fore what many saw to be the hypocritical nature of their so-called Christian masters, including the very practice of holding slaves itself, but also the way that their masters treated them. And one of the key reasons that African Americans in the 19th century embraced Freethought was an inability to resolve the problem of evil, or the question of how to reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the presence of a benevolent and omnipotent deity. As Epicurus asked over 2,000 years ago, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able or willing? Then why call him God? For many slaves, the problem of evil was intimately related to their daily lives, as a central component of slavery was suffering, both physical, mental, and emotional. While many slaves did find meaning in religion, whether monotheistic ones such as Christianity or Islam, or African-derived traditions such as conjure, others rejected religion altogether. The historian of slave religion, Al Rabbitoe, notes that the meaning that many slaves found in religion was not so much an answer to the problem of suffering, but rather an acceptance of the sorrow and joy inherent in the human condition, and an affirmation that life itself was valuable. But for many slaves, they didn't believe that life under bondage, under any condition, was valuable, and they needed an answer to the problem of suffering before they could accept the idea of God or gods. When this answer did not come, they embraced atheism as the only logical solution to the problem of evil. Another key development that fostered the growth of African American atheism was pro-slavery religion. One reason that William Wells Brown never took his master's admonitions very seriously was because of what he called slavery's evangelical bloodhounds and its religious slaveholders. Another enslaved man named Henry Bibb notes in his autobiography that the slaves, with but few exceptions, have no confidence at all in their preaching, in white ministers' preaching, because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine, he said. They say, "Servants, be obedient to your masters, and he that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes." Most slaves feel they are destined to die in bondage unless they are delivered by some deity, Bibb notes. But when that does not happen, they cannot believe or trust in such a religion as above named. Now, aside from the freethinker Frederick Douglass, what we see during the era of slavery is primarily atheism and agnosticism, not secular humanism. This is partially because slaves didn't have access to education like other intellectuals did during this period, and also just because of their very condition of being in bondage. If and when slaves were lucky enough to gain their freedom, like Frederick Douglass, like William Wells Brown, then they often did embrace humanism as well as their religious skepticism. Now, the historian of Freethought, Susan Jacoby, has referred to the late 19th and the early 20th century as the golden age of American freethought. We might think of the era of the Harlem Renaissance, namely the 1920s and the 1930s, as the golden age of African American freethought. The Harlem Renaissance, really you could call it the New Negro Renaissance as well, because it wasn't centered in just Harlem. It took place in other cities throughout the United States and throughout the African diaspora. But this was sort of a cultural revolution of sorts. It was a way of using culture as an argument for racial equality, right? So Charles Johnson, Alain Locke, W.B. Du Bois, and others that were promoting this sort of greatly expanded output in African American art, novelists, poetry, things like that, saw black culture as a means of alleviating segregation and racial inequality within the United States. So this New Negro Renaissance had its roots in a great migration of the 19-teens and the 1920s, which saw roughly 1.5 million African Americans migrate from the South to northern cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. One of the principal writers of the Harlem Renaissance to articulate some key themes of freethought was Nella Larsen. In fact, she published what can probably be called the first freethought novel in 1928, titled Quicksand. She was one of the first black woman novelists. Now, Nella Larsen was living in Harlem in the late 1920s, so she was a part of this New Negro Renaissance. And in her novel Quicksand, she basically wrote about herself, right? So the novel centers on a mixed-race woman like Larsen named Helga Crane. It opens up at a school called Naxos, and with Helga sort of articulating her dissatisfaction with life at Naxos. Naxos basically represents Tuskegee University, where Nella Larsen worked for a little bit. And part of the reason that Helga Crane really can't stand it at Naxos is because of what she sees to be the sort of religious hypocrisy, not only of white ministers that are coming in and preaching to the black students, but also of the African American faculty and administrators at the school. So Helga ends up leaving Naxos, goes to Chicago for a bit, then to Harlem, moves to Copenhagen for a couple of years, comes back to Harlem, and after being spurned by the former principal of Naxos in Harlem, she stumbles into a storefront church, and the next day she ends up marrying the revival preacher at that church, a man named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. So she moves with Green down to some rural black community in Alabama, right? And she's the preacher's wife down there. Within about 20 months, she has 3 kids. At the end of the novel, she has another kid on the way, and she realized that she basically ruined her life. Here's one quote from the book that kind of really sums up Larsen's free thought philosophy, as well as that of a number of other Harlem Renaissance writers. With the obscuring curtain of religion rent, she was able to look about her and see with shocked eyes this thing she had done to herself. She couldn't, she thought ironically, even blame God for it, now that she knew he didn't exist. No more than she could pray to him for the death of her husband, the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green, the white man's God, and his great love for all people regardless of race. What idiotic nonsense she had allowed herself to believe. How could anyone have been so deluded? How could 10 million black folk credit it when daily before their lives was enacted its contradiction? So in this kind of short quotation, we also see Larsen speaking to this problem of evil, right? How can black people who are enduring segregation and increased racist violence, a resuscitation of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, increased nativism during the 1920s. How can black people believe in the white man's God, right? Here she's also sort of anticipating an important stream of black theology that would emerge in the early 19th century, namely humanocentric theism, where William R. Jones argued that against black theologians of his time, that, yeah, you can say God is a God of the oppressed and God is on the side of black people, but if you look at human history, you could also say that God is a white racist and God hates black people, right? So these themes start to occur during the 1920s and 30s, and Jones would sort of synthesize, I think, a lot of this writing in articulating his theology of humanocentric theism. Another major freethinker of the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston, and she sort of articulated a lot of her beliefs in her 1942 autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. Hurston really kind of goes back and forth between deism and agnosticism, right, in her autobiography. She says, I'm not really sure if God exists, but if God does exist, then I don't need to pray to him. Like, this God doesn't really, he's not intimately involved in human life, right? He's not a providential force within the world, which is exactly what the deists of the 18th century believed. She also believed in Ludwig Feuerbach's idea that he first proposed in his 1841 book, The Essence of Christianity, where he said that God is basically a mental projection of human beings, right? God didn't create human beings created God. So she sort of buys into that. And in this quote I have here on the slide, she's basically sort of reformulating some of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, saying that Christianity is basically a religion of the weak, right? That strong people don't need religion. Now, while some African Americans during the 1920s and 1930s eschewed sort of overt political radicalism, and Hurston and Larsen would be in that category, they were radical thinkers, but they weren't really involved in leftist radical politics. Others certainly were in the 1920s and 30s. So the same period of the Harlem Renaissance, we see a very close intersection between black socialists, communists, and black freethinkers. Now, socialism and communism were very appealing to black freethinkers because some of the leading intellectuals of those two political ideologies were themselves atheists, right? And if you read some of the records of the Communist International during the 19-teens and 20s, you can see that even 50, 60 years after Marx first started formulating communism, communists in Russia and elsewhere basically took it for granted that if you were a communist, you were an atheist, right? Now, communists and socialists also sort of propose a kind of radical interracialism and accepting black people into their parties. And they also did some work trying to defend black people from racist violence and racist prosecutions, especially the Communist Party's role in the defense of the Scottsboro boys who were falsely accused of rape in Alabama in the early 1930s. So these are just some of the reasons why socialism and communism were sort of appealing to African Americans of this time period. And a number of important black intellectuals sort of bought into both atheism and communism. Louise Thompson Patterson, pictured here, Hubert Harrison, some of you might have heard of him. Harry Haywood was rose to a very prominent position within the Communist Party. Also W.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright. Hubert Harrison was known as alternatively as the father of black radicalism and as the black Socrates for his sort of deep erudition and knowledge of a whole broad number of topics. You might even think of Hubert Harrison as sort of an African-American Robert Ingersoll of his day, because he was very much known for his speaking abilities, right? Now, he didn't travel around the country speaking like Ingersoll did. He mainly traveled around the 5 boroughs of New York City. And his 2 main spots were Union Square in downtown Manhattan and on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. And oftentimes he would sort of rise up on a stepladder and talk about free thought, talk about socialism, communism. He saw himself as sort of an intellectual descendant of Thomas Paine, right? Somebody that would bring the good news of free thought to the African-American community. At the same time, he was a member of the Socialist Party, and they specifically engaged him to try to spread socialism among blacks. So in the mind of Harrison, socialism and free thought were very intimately intertwined, right? And in helping to convert blacks to free thought, that would also help to bring them into the socialist camp and sort of vice versa. Another important communist freethinker of this time period was Richard Wright. Richard Wright published his autobiography, Black Boy, in 1945. And the central theme of this autobiography is his growing rejection of Christianity, right? I've read a lot of sort of literary theory and criticism of Wright's autobiography, and it's baffling that more people aren't writing about his critiques of Christianity, because out of maybe 300 pages of this memoir, he spends 150 to 200 pages talking about how he slowly but surely moved away from Christianity from the time that he was 4 years old until the time that he was 16. Wright eventually moved to Chicago and then to Harlem, becoming a part of the sort of latter end of this new Negro Renaissance. He joined the communists for a bit, as most black freethinkers of this time period did, but later on he repudiated communism because he felt it was too similar to a religion, and he felt that it was sort of anti-intellectual and didn't promote free thought. He would move to France, start writing there, and eventually embrace existentialism. Now, Wright was heavily criticized, ironically enough, by other black freethinkers for his embrace of Sartrean existentialism. So freethinkers like J. Saunders Redding critiqued him, basically saying that in articulating existentialist themes in novels like Native Son and later on The Outsider, that he was basically being inauthentic to black life, right? He was off there in France, and he was so far removed from black culture that he was no longer authentically black. And I say that this is ironic. Lorraine Hansberry said the same thing about him in one review. And this is ironic because black atheists themselves, of which Redding and Hansberry were, are also seen as inauthentically black, right? Because of their acceptance of atheism. Now, probably the most kind of towering intellectual, black intellectual of the 20th century was W.B. Du Bois, and he represents a bridge of sorts between the Harlem Renaissance, of which he was a participant and a promoter as the editor of the NAACP's Crisis magazine, of radical politics, of which he participated in the 1930s and 40s, and of the civil rights movement, because he lived so darn long, right? He lived from 1868 until 1963. So he was a part of sort of all of these movements during the early to mid 20th century. He started moving towards free thought while he was a student at Harvard University, and in his autobiography, he says that he eventually accepted free thought while he was doing graduate work in Germany. And not coincidentally, I would argue, this is also the time when he became a socialist. socialists, participating in socialist rallies in Germany. Now, Dubois presents sort of a good segue, I think, into the influence of free thought during the civil rights movement. Now, most people see the civil rights movement as a religious movement, right? This is because of the prominence of religious figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., as well as religious organizations, right, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But the thing is, very few black churches actually participated in any type of civil rights organizing or civil rights politics. Barbara Savage, a religious historian, argues that less than 10% of black churches in the 1950s and 60s participated in civil rights. Most of them were conservative, and they weren't necessarily happy with the status quo, but they thought if they tried to change it, then what came after would be worse than the status quo. So just as in earlier periods, black freethinkers were central players in the civil rights movement, and we can see this especially in Black Power, which emerged out of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, and its institutional manifestation, the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was started by Huey Newton, an atheist, and Bobby Seale in 1966, primarily to promote anti-imperialism and to combat police violence and police brutality against black people in Oakland in particular and in the larger Bay Area. This is in 1966. I argue in my book that the Black Panther Party was a secular organization. Right, and this is one of the major sort of transformations in secularism during the 20th century. So Susan Jacoby argues that secularism kind of declines in the 1920s because of the challenge of fundamentalism. And that is true to an extent, that secular organizations started to lose membership, but you started to see more secularists in other, not explicitly secular organizations like the Communist Party and like the Black Panther Party, right? If you look at the 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party, it's a secular organization, right? They're promoting increased access to education, health care for black people. After 1969, all Black Panther chapters had to have free medical clinics. They had a breakfast program that served roughly 22,000 kids daily in 1970. They opened up schools all across the country. They did job training, things like that. The central slogan of the Black Panther Party was all power to the people, right? And Huey Newton is very clear in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, that he developed this phrase as sort of a humanist counterpoint to Christianity, right? Because he looked around at the ministers of the time period, and he looked at the African-American religion and saw it, argued that it was otherworldly, right? It was not promoting justice and equality in this world. It was saying that you would have it in the next world. So he developed all power to the people and told people you don't have to wait until you go to heaven for equality. You can grasp it right now, and that power is within the hands of human beings, right? So, overall conclusions from this research. One of the sort of major stereotypes of African Americans is that they are naturally religious. When I tell people what I'm working on, they say, oh, I've never heard of a black atheist. I say, yes, you have. You've heard of W.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright and Zora and Neale Hurston. You've heard of these people. You just don't know that they're not religious, right? So I think this research can show that African American free thought has been sort of a central and significant component of black culture and politics dating to the early 19th century, right? a lot of history books are based on, very obscure archives that really aren't accessible to the average college student or just the average person. But my history is really, I do some archival research, but most of it is based on accessible primary sources. All of the people that I mentioned today, just go read their autobiographies, go read their collections of poetry, right? The slaves that I mentioned, you can go to a website, it should be docsouth.unc.edu. You can find their slave narratives where they talk about the sort of religious opinions of other slaves. So these are very accessible sources, right? And for me, I think it's really important to kind of research and teach this history. One, as a professional historian, I'm just sort of trying to make a contribution to my field, but I also hope, as an atheist, to show, especially younger black skeptics today that, they're not alone, they're not isolated, that they're part of a sort of a larger and a vibrant intellectual tradition that includes some of the most prominent figures within African American history. Thank you.